Over the decades, drug companies have had an enormous vested interest in statin drugs.
It's the most profitable group of drugs in the history of the world. Something like 15 to 25 billion with a B dollars per year spent on these drugs. So that's higher than the gross national product of many countries around the world.
Lipitor is the best-selling drug in history. So in terms of costs, total sales of Lipitor have been in the range of $140 billion since it came on the market in 1996.
Another concern relates to the actual definition of high cholesterol. Just a few years ago, a total cholesterol level above 250 was considered high, but this threshold has now been lowered to 200. These guidelines originated from an expert panel of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute in America and were adopted by several other countries. The lowering of the threshold, effectively changing the definition of high cholesterol, meant that millions more people became eligible for statin medications. This raised controversy because 8 out of the 9 experts on the panel had financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies that make statins. Although the guidelines were decided by a small number of doctors, they are followed by hundreds of thousands of doctors worldwide.
We have been told year by year that we should lower cholesterol even more and more and more. And where is the evidence? I haven't seen any evidence for that argument. The great problem is that these recommendations are written by people paid by the drug industry. How can anybody believe in such recommendations?
The push to lower cholesterol in the wider population continues. A group of doctors published an article claiming that statins could counter the effects of eating a burger. They suggested that statins be handed out as free condiments, just like ketchup.
Because it gives people that false reassurance that it's okay if you eat this food that is not good for your health, because then you're going to take this pill that's going to make it okay. And that's very attractive, but it is a fallacy. It's just not true, and it's still bad for your health to eat processed foods, eat trans fats, and have a regular diet of fast food hamburgers.
And the absurdity doesn't stop there. Here in the US, it was even suggested that statins be put in the public water supply.
A couple of weeks ago about conflicts of interest in the United States governmental dietary guidelines. And what I found that 95% of people who made those guidelines had industry ties, as I mentioned earlier, ILC, et cetera.
95% of the people that made the 2020 nutrition guidelines have been directly paid by food and or pharmaceutical companies. Coca-Cola, Kraft, the 2025 panel, you can't even make this up. More than a fourth of all the announced panel has been directly paid by Novo Nordisk, who's the maker of Ozempic. So more than a fourth of the physicians who are making our nutritional guidelines are on the payroll of an obesity drug maker.
Well, what we find about cholesterol guidelines is very similar. So in 2000 and 2004, the National Cholesterol Education Panel revised the guidelines for cholesterol with no new data, but they lowered the level of LDL and total cholesterol that was felt to be acceptable and optimal with no new data. And many more people were then eligible for statins. It was later found that 8 of the 9 people on the NCEP, the National Cholesterol Education Panel, had financial ties to makers of statins. Bullshit. What the heck, you guys? What the heck? It's corrupt. How can it not be corrupt? Furthermore, if we're back to this paper from Marianne Damasi, she talks about the fact that Care Excellence, called NICE, announced it planned to have the risk threshold for prescribing statins from 20% to 10% over 10 years. Doctors vigorously objected to the change. A UK survey revealed that 2/3 of general practitioners would be disregarding the advice to offer statins to people at the newly proposed threshold of 10% on the grounds that it was not evidence-based, could lead to medicalization of healthy people at the cost of more needy, unwell patients. Skepticism was inevitable once it was revealed that 8 of the 12 on that panel as well had financial ties to manufacturers of cholesterol-lowering drugs. What? the industry is corrupt. The industry is focused on money, and we must be skeptical of this.
This guy, Steve Nissen, for example, he says, well, you know, if you're against statins, you're like an anti-vaxxer. That's what he says, right? And it's like, well, he's also the guy who's taking all the money from Amgen and Pfizer and everything, right? So it's not an unbiased opinion. And then you get like crazy, crazy stuff, you know, like talking about the statins, that, oh, everybody should be getting it. They should be putting it in the drinking water. Everybody over the age of 50 should be getting it. It's like, where are these opinions coming from? Because if you look at the actual science, which Malcolm does, it's not there. There's nothing to support that sort of use to put these drugs into, you know, the mouths of millions of patients. Yet, as a family physician, as a medical student, you get taught by these people, then they write guidelines that you're almost forced to follow, because otherwise you're not following standard of practice. So you're almost forced to give these because they wrote that guideline. So here's the insider's view. So Marcia Angell said it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. And again, this is the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. So this is an insider who spent decades working at evidence-based medicine, saying that evidence-based medicine is actually so corrupt as to be useless or harmful. This is basically what she's saying, and she reached this conclusion only after several decades of being in it. Then you have crooked guidelines. So we know all about crooked physicians, and they don't think they're crooked, right? They think they're good people, but they take a lot of money from pharmaceuticals. But then they write guidelines which are obviously biased. So if you look at this, you can compare two guidelines, one with conflicts of interest and one with no conflicts of interest. So there are red flags. So these are listed on the side. If your sponsor is a conflicted professional organization, that's a red flag. Industry sponsorship, you know, multiple panelists are conflicted. They're all red flags. If you look at this single test for PSA, you can look. So on the left-hand side, looking at PSA, saying is PSA a good test or a bad test? And you see that they actually pass all those red flags. So their guidelines committee is set up properly. There's nobody who's conflicted. The sponsor, the U.S. Preventive Health, they don't take industry money and all this sort of stuff. And basically what they say is that PSA is useless. Recommends against PSA screening. Okay, it's useless. At the very same time, you have the American Urological Association on the right, which does have multiple red flags. That is, they take a lot of money from industry. All the people who write the guidelines are taking money from industry, and sometimes a lot of money. And what they say is that they promote screening. In fact, we should lower the age of baseline screening to 40. It's like, oh my God, you're saying PSA saves lives, and the difference between the two, because they're looking at the same exact studies, is that one has conflicts of interest and the other does not. These are the exact same trials they're looking at. It's the exact same data. The difference is how you make up the guidelines. And yet, when you have guidelines that start to come out, it's very difficult, because then as a practicing physician, if you don't prescribe these things, you could get nicked on not following the standard of practice. But the standard of practice is set by a number of physicians who have a large amount of conflicts of interest, right? And the stuff is like just so obvious, right? The Archives of Internal Medicine said failure of clinical practice guidelines, because these clinical practice guidelines, how to set up a committee to write guidelines, they've been around a long time, 2 more decades of little, if any, progress. And what they're saying is that if you look at the guidelines, since they initially published 20 years ago, and this is now 26 years ago, how to set up guidelines, they say, well, 71% of committee chairs had conflicts of interest. And 91% of co-chairs had conflicts of interest. In fact, that means the people who lead these guideline committee, they're on the take, right? And that's the big problem. So we haven't made any progress, even though this issue was raised 26 years ago.
Next year, this is a sister book of this one, okay? And this is also published from JAS, and it says treatment guide for this epidemic. Okay. I tried to find COI information again. Yes, I found it. The very first page, yeah, they wrote COI information here. Okay, this one is just for the rules of disclosing COI. And this part is just list of Japanese pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment companies and publishers. Where are authors of this guideline? Nobody is here. It's the list of companies. Is this COI information? I don't think so. So we do not understand which researcher is getting fund of money or something from which company. No, nothing at all. Just a list of companies. And it says COI. Well, you can laugh it. Laugh at this. But to be honest, I'm not sure to laugh at it or to cry. This kind of guidelines are of the big pharma, by the big pharma, and for the big pharma. It's crazy.